I kept seeing this over and over again. Black people not being able to vote. And I'm thinking, now, I have a very dirty mind. The first thing I'm thinking, it's almost as if there's some kind of computer program which is targeting black people to remove them from the voter rolls. And I just thought I'd show it to you. This is right out of the computers of Catherine Harris and the Florida Department of Elections. Here it is. This is how the election was won, or lost, how democracy lost. And if you look at it, I was able to get these out of, there's a list of 57,700 names. I'm looking down the list. In fact, you could look with me. And if you I just picked this one, which kind of caught my attention. There's a Thomas Cooper, a ne'er-do-well, another one of these. See, these are supposed to be felons, mother rapers, and father stabbers, and terrible people who should not be allowed to vote. They've committed crimes in Florida. Okay, that's fair enough. Whether I like the law, it's only that those laws only exist in the old Confederacy states. But we're not talking about whether that's good or bad. If they can't vote, they can't vote. I'm looking, so here's Thomas Cooper, and you got to look at this. And it says, and he was convicted of a crime on January 30th, 2007. Traveled back. And so I'm thinking, wow, that Catherine Harris. I mean, Catherine Harris, detective of the future, goes into the, goes into the next century and finds all the bad guys and brings them back and says, you can't vote here in Florida, right? So, and I'm looking through the list, and I had volunteers help me crack these codes from out of the computers, a CD-ROM of all the names, and I found over 400 names of people convicted in the future. I had people convicted before they were born. Okay, there were other things that I found fascinating. You could just go through the list and you find some very fascinating things. In fact, there's Jane Doe, that evil woman. Fascinating. But if they can't vote, they can't vote even in the future. But I noticed something else. And if you go down the list, and you'll see, let's see if I can do this. Okay, you'll see something very interesting here. It says black, black, white, white, black, white, black, black, white, black, black, white, black, black. Now, do you see a pattern? 54% of the names on the list were black people. By the way, you might find it interesting that the Florida Department of Elections, of all the information they keep, is the race of voters. Now, that was ironically meant to protect voters, black voters. In the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the idea was to put down a voter's race so that you would know that black people weren't being unfairly excluded. This is the days before computers were able to use that as a way to zero in and zone in and exclude those things. 54%. Now, 54% of the people on the list are felons. Well, that's a harsh reality we'll have to get used to. But there is one problem, besides Thomas Cooper convicted in the future. 400 names convicted in the future, and there are 4,000 names where there's no conviction date. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we went through name by name. And I actually called called up Thomas Cooper's. Thomas Cooper, right? The guy from the future. Do you have any idea how many Thomas Coopers there are in Florida? Okay, just try the phone book. I just tried actually the name before him, David Butler. I happen to know there's 77 listed in Florida alone. Now, if any Thomas Cooper anywhere in the United States ever at any time committed a felony crime, they would, and as long as they were BLA as their race, it would zoom in and tag that name as a felon. All I had to do was also match a birth date. If you take a birthday and you made them each a birthday city in the United States, it would be 750,000 people. How many Thomas Coopers in that city of that birthday? So how many of these people were felons, criminals? I started out, it looked like 15% were not felons. Now keep in mind, the race in Florida, the presidency of the United States was determined officially by 537 votes as certified by Catherine Harris, the Secretary of State. So then we went through name by name, and we demographers and statisticians, and what we found was that at least 90.2% of the people on that list are innocent of any crime except being black. Now you do the arithmetic, 57,700 voters, 90.2% of them innocent of any crime, and 54% of them black. And we know the color of the black vote. You tell me who won the presidency of the United States. I went back into Harris's files and the Department of Elections files and got the email traffic. You know, you can get that if they don't start burning it. We'll talk about that too. The email traffic. And it said, remember Thomas Cooper, the future criminal? Well, some clerk said, you know what? We've got people convicted in the future. What do we do? Now, I went to, I grew up kind of lower working class, so I went to public school in Los Angeles. But even I know what you do if you improperly excluded someone from the voter rolls and taken away their civil rights. You give them back their right to vote. That seemed pretty simple. But the Republican functionaries, the top Republican guys running the Department of Elections, said, if you blank out the conviction dates, no one will know. And there are 4,000 blanked out conviction dates on those files. 4,000. They just missed some. 4,000 blanked out, removed, erased. Why? Okay. And then I went back through and I said, who were these guys that made up this list? Who were these guys? And if you read Michael Moore's book, or he cites my stuff, it's a company called Database Technologies out of Florida, owned by a company called Choice Point of Atlanta, a good, solid Republican company. On the board of directors, Jim Langone and other big sugar daddy funders. Other Republican Party, like Langone, was the treasurer of Rudy Giuliani's ill-fated senatorial campaign against Hillary Clinton, which he dropped after his enlarged prostate was found where it shouldn't be. And but this could be Republican firm. But there is one thing. I looked, and everyone mentioned this was brought out, but they did not start out with the contract. The company that started out with the contract was called Professional Services, Inc. And they charged for creating this list of supposed felons, looking through records and coming up with names like Thomas Cooper. They charged the state $5,000 per year. They were fired. There was a bid put out, and the highest bidder was Database Technologies. And they got the contract because they opened the bid, saw Database Technologies was the highest bidder. The Republican officials announced that the bids would not be accepted, that they would that they would have a non-bid negotiation with the highest bidder. And which bid $3 million, they signed a contract for $4 million after negotiations. Now that was kind of interesting. I found that interesting. No American media found that interesting, but I found it interesting. But I wanted to find out what else about this contract. So I wanted this wonderful contract, this no-bid contract. I got some documents. I like documents. God, I feel like Joe McCarthy. I've got some documents here. The difference between Joe McCarthy and me is I've got the documents. I'll show them to you. And in fact, I got one document, and my producer at Newsnight, BBC, said, get on a plane. And we shot down with our camera crew and went down and to Florida to meet with Clayton Harris. Clayton Harris, that's a wrong name. Boy, that was a bad one. Clayton Roberts, that's a kind of squat, bull-necked character who is in charge of the Florida Department of Elections, which is under Catherine Harris. Now, those of you who were here last time saw what happened when I showed up with my BBC camera crew. And I sat down, I actually had a very polite conversation with Mr. Roberts. And I started to pull out this document. And then he rips off his microphone, does the 50-yard dash into his office, locks the door, and calls in the state police. And the Smokies come in and pull out me and my camera crew. We're Frog March out building. And now, by the way, this is the document. I see none of you running for the doors, locking yourself in a closet. It doesn't seem very frightening to me, but there was a lot to ask about here as soon as he saw this. And it says, first of all, it says Exhibit A, and it says confidential and secret information. Well, it's kind of interesting for a state contract, a no-bid state contract. Well, it's confidential and secret. Well, you can see why Mr. Roberts had a little problem. Because he testified before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, which was very interested in my research. They called him in and they asked about this felon list after they had read my reports coming out of Britain. And Mr. Roberts testified under oath that the verification of the list was left to the county supervisors. Now, it says right here that it is the contractor in his office that the fee of $2 million for the first year, $2.1 million, includes manual verification using telephone calls and statistical sampling. That's kind of interesting. So first, the verification was back in his office, something a little different than he testified to under oath. Even more, what does that mean, manual verification by telephone? So I talked to experts, and they said, yeah, you don't knock off people's civil rights without making a phone call. Now, it said Thomas Cooper of Ohio. You can call not only Cooper and find out if he has an explanation, but you can call people and say, is this Thomas Cooper's from Ohio? There's many ways to check. You make some phone calls to find out if your list is correct. In fact, the first list they had out of the state of Texas, and I can't remember who was governor of the state of Texas, had 8,000 names, 8,000 names on it, and every single one of those names is wrong. Every single one were people who had just committed misdemeanors, like the governor, who's drunk while driving, and they couldn't vote. So, by the way, if there's a George W. Bush in Florida, they'd lose their vote. But that list was supposedly corrected. But I was very interested in a method that verified things in which the first list that came out was 100% every single name wrong. And then the other list, final list, was at least 90.2% wrong. I'm going to explain the word at least in a minute. I don't want to forget that. So how could they get it all wrong? So we have verification. It's sampling telephone calls. So I called Database Technologies, and I had a lot of not pleasant conversations with them, but wanted to get their side of it. I said, now it says here, sirs, that it calls for manual verification using telephone calls. Can I have the call sheets, please? Because those are public documents. You're under a public contract. No call sheets. I said, well, do you have any records of the calls? Then they said something very interesting. He said, well, it says telephone calls, but that doesn't actually mean dialing a phone. This is very new age. This is very future. You know, and so that's one of the things I want to ask Mr. Roberts about was these telepathic phone calls that were paid for by the state at a very high price. Because I also got photocopies of the checks to make sure they got paid for this work. So I was interested in those telephone calls. And then, what about the statistical sampling? Now, this was the excuse for hiring Database Technologies. They are the company that works for the FBI, hunting down people who skip bail, hunting down bad people. I'll tell you about their hunting down the Bin Laden family. And they know one Bin Laden from another. I'll tell you about that story later. There's 52 brothers and sisters, that's why it's an issue. I'll explain. That comes up later in we'll bring that up. Don't let me forget about that one. But the FBI doesn't pay for 90.2% wrong. They don't pay for 90.2% wrong. And the reason they hired Database Technologies, it has 8 billion, and with ChoicePoint altogether, 20 billion records on you. They know what you did on your third date in high school. They've got it in the records. They've got your driver's license data. They've got your credit card number. They've got your social security number. They have got you nailed. And they know Thomas Cooper of Florida, which of the 77 we're talking about, because they've got his driver's license and everything else. And in fact, they go back to the emails. They wrote emails to the state saying that there are people on the list who are, quote, not felons, end quote. And they said, here's how you can correct the list. Now, in the bid for the millions, it said that they would use, the most important is what's called change of address, so you can follow someone's address. You get the right address. Didn't even know the address, which Thomas Cooper address, right? Change of address, address history from the post office. They had driver's license records, all these records that they had in the bid that had justified the millions of dollars that they were going to do all this cross-checking. 267 million cross-checks were promised, paid for. And then in handwritten notations in Catherine Harris's office, it says, don't need. And I can tell you they didn't do, they said, we told them to do it. And they told us not to do it. I said, you violated your contract. I said, it's not a violation of the contract when the state of Florida says, who's the contractor, says, don't do it. We will pay you, don't do it. That's still open for question. The NAACP has now sued Database Technology based on his research, and an agreement not to do it, which results in taking away people's civil rights. There'll still be a trial beginning in August on this matter. Now, are we getting the feeling about deliberate? Because see, if you've gone through the database, you've start out knocking out 90.2%, which you can knock out like that. Simple cross-checks. There were still, suddenly, instead of knocking out 54% of a list of 57,000 names, you're down to 5,000 names. Could still change the election. How many ne'er-do-wells were there? Well,